She set the last fork down, smoothed her apron, and checked the clock twice before the doorbell rang. She had no idea one habit that night would still work 70 years later. This was a Tuesday in a brand new Cape Cod house outside Philadelphia, the kind of house that sold for under $8,000 in the post-war building boom of the late 1940s. Millions of young couples like this one had never owned a dining room before, and they treated it like sacred ground. The rules of hosting were not written down anywhere in that house. They lived in the hands and habits of the woman who ran it, passed down and practiced until they became instinct. The first habit was simple, and it was unbreakable. Guests were never, ever supposed to arrive early. Etiquette columns of the era taught that showing up before the stated hour was ruder than showing up 15 minutes late, because it caught the hostess mid-preparation, apron still on, roast still resting. The ritual was never written down, but every good hostess knew it by heart, and every good guest respected the clock as much as she did. Second habit, the cocktail hour had a clock of its own. 5:30 for drinks, 7 or 7:30 for dinner, taught in Ladies' Home Journal and McCall's as plainly as a recipe. The martini, gin, or vodka with dry vermouth was the reigning drink of the decade. Poured slow, served with conversation, never rushed toward the table. That hour of standing and talking before anyone sat down did more social work than most modern parties manage in an entire evening. Third, the good china never touched a Tuesday supper. Because bridal registries had exploded in the post-war years, a young bride often owned full sets of china, crystal, and silver before she had cooked a single dinner party meal. She kept them locked away from everyday use on purpose. That divide between everyday plates and company plates was not vanity. It was a quiet, disciplined kind of financial planning, dressed up as tradition. Fourth habit, she never sat her guests wherever they happened to land. A seating chart, sometimes just place cards in her own handwriting, existed even for a dinner of 6 or 8 people. The rule was to alternate husbands and wives, to break up existing pairs of friends, to force the table to actually mix. It was quiet social engineering, done with a fountain pen, and it is almost entirely gone from how we gather today. Fifth, the hostess positioned herself where she could see the whole table without turning her head. Etiquette writers of the era framed this as pure function, not vanity. A hostess seated at the head or along the center of a long side could watch every face, catch a lagging conversation, and steer it back to life before anyone noticed the silence. Table setting was never just decoration. It was a control panel for the entire evening. Sixth, the thank you note was not optional and it was not late. A guest was expected to write and mail one within a day or two of the party, and etiquette columns treated a missing note as a real remembered offense. Miss it twice and the next invitation might simply stop coming. It disappeared from dinner parties, but it still works, because nothing tells a hostess her labor was seen quite like ink on paper the very next morning. Seventh, a guest never arrived at the door with nothing in her hands, and she never expected her wine to be poured that night. The hostess gift was flowers already arranged in their own container, so nobody had to stop and hunt for a vase mid-party, or a small box of candy, or a bottle set aside for later. It was a small ritual with a big rule underneath it. Never add a single extra task to a hostess already carrying the whole evening. Eighth, the multi-course dinner was built for a woman working alone. Most of these households had no dishwasher yet, and the servant that her own mother might have employed was gone by the post-war years. So the casserole, the congealed salad, the dishes that could be built a day ahead and simply finished in the oven were not lesser cooking. They were survival strategy for a woman running a formal evening entirely on her own 2 hands. Ninth, the table itself followed a language of its own: 3 forks, 2 knives, 2 spoons, a bread plate with its own tiny knife, up to 3 glasses for water and 2 wines. It sounds like a test, but it was taught as ordinary hostess knowledge, not advanced skill. The rule guests actually needed was simple: work from the outside in, 1 course at a time, and the table would tell you exactly what to do next. 10th, the bridge club or the canasta table was not just a game night. It was scheduled social infrastructure, a standing weekly or bi-weekly appointment that guaranteed a reason to clean the house, set a table, and see the same circle of women again and again. That regularity built friendship, the way nothing casual ever quite manages. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and the weekly card table was one of its quiet engines. 11th, she planned the menu around what could survive being made a day early. A roast could rest. A gelatin salad practically demanded advance work. This was not a shortcut taken in shame. It was published, celebrated advice from the test kitchens of Good Housekeeping and Ladies' Home Journal, institutions that vetted party menus specifically so a housewife with no help could still pull off 4 courses without falling apart by 6 o'clock. 12th, the punch bowl, the chip and dip set, the highball glasses, none of it arrived all at once. Families saved for it, page by page, through catalogs like the S&H Green Stamps Redemption Book, collected one grocery trip at a time. Company items were a category all their own, earned slowly and treated like small trophies once they finally sat on the shelf, untouched until guests came through the door. 13th, the calling card still had its final duties even as the decade wore on. By the late 1950s, the strict old ritual of leaving an engraved card at a neighbor's door was fading toward the phone call and the mailed invitation, but etiquette columnists still taught it for introductions and for condolence calls. It was a habit dying slowly, in plain sight, and almost nobody noticed the exact year it finally stopped. 14th, the living room itself became a kind of stage for commerce and community both. Brownie Wise built the entire Tupperware home party model in the early 1950s around exactly this instinct. And by mid-decade, Tupperware had pulled off store shelves completely, selling only through parties held in ordinary women's living rooms. If a company could build a national business on the idea that a woman's parlor was worth gathering in, that tells you everything about how central that room really was. 15th, casual entertaining was never the opposite of formal entertaining. It ran right alongside it. The backyard barbecue, the covered dish supper where every family brought one item, the coffee clatch over the back fence. These were just as much a part of the decade as any candlelit dinner. Your grandmother knew how to make a room feel like home, whether she had 4 courses on the table or a single covered dish and a folding chair. 16th, the hostess herself was almost never the only labor in the room, even without hired help, because the women's magazines had built an entire invisible support system around her. Test kitchens, seasonal menu plans, table setting diagrams printed month after month, these functioned as a shared national curriculum. A housewife in Ohio and a housewife in Georgia could set nearly identical tables that same week, taught by the same 3 or 4 magazines sitting on millions of coffee tables. 17th, the party favor of the era was not a party favor at all. It was the seating itself, arranged so a shy guest never sat isolated at the end of a long table. A good hostess studied her guest list the way a director studies a script, deciding who needed to sit near the fire of the conversation and who needed a quieter corner. Nobody called it hosting craft back then. They just called it being a good hostess. 18th, entertaining at home was simply cheaper, and everyone understood the math without saying it aloud. A roast for 8 people, wine, and a homemade dessert could be pulled together for well under $20 in the mid-1950s, a fraction of what the same evening would cost at a restaurant. Hosting was not just tradition. It was the obviously smarter choice for a young family building a household on one paycheck. 19th, the television was allowed in as a novelty guest, not yet as the center of the room. Early in the decade, a hostess might gather everyone around the new set for a special program before dinner, a curiosity to be shared. It took years before that same box quietly pulled the whole evening away from the table and toward the couch, and by the time anyone noticed, the shift was already permanent. 20th, and this is the one that never had a name. She never let a silence sit too long. Between the seating chart, the timed cocktail hour, the observant seat at the table, Every single habit fed into this one final skill, keeping a room of near strangers comfortable enough to talk for 3 straight hours. That is not decoration. That is a craft, quietly perfected in kitchens across the country and almost entirely lost to us now. Look closer at that Tuesday night, and you start to see how much of it was choreography, not chance. Every habit we have named so far worked because it removed one small friction point between the hostess and a good evening. Let's go back to the beginning, because there is more to that arriving guest, that clock on the wall, than a simple rule of politeness. The habit of never arriving early had a second layer nobody talks about. It gave the hostess a private, guaranteed window to do the very last things: light the candles, check the roast, pour the ice into the bucket without an audience watching her work. Guests respecting that window was really guests respecting her labor, even if none of them would have used that word for it. The cocktail hour did something else too. It gave the food time to finish without anyone hovering near the kitchen door. A roast resting, a sauce reducing, needs unattended minutes, and a room full of guests happily occupied with a martini and conversation in the living room bought exactly that. It disappeared from dinner parties, but it still works, whether you call it a cocktail hour or simply giving your kitchen room to breathe. The good china rule protected something beyond the plates themselves. Using the wedding china only for company kept its condition pristine for decades, which is exactly why so many of those sets survive intact in attics and cedar chests today, found by granddaughters who never once saw them used. That untouched china is, in its own small way, a time capsule of restraint. The seating chart habit solved a problem most modern hosts do not even think to name: the friend clump. Left alone, guests will always sit with who they already know, and a party of 8 quietly becomes 2 silent pairs and 1 loud corner. Forcing new pairings at the table was not cruelty. It was the deliberate creation of new conversation that would never have happened by accident. The hostess seat had one more function worth naming. It let her time the courses without ever leaving the table for long. From that vantage point, she could read plates, read faces, and know exactly when to rise and clear without a single spoken cue. It looked effortless because it was rehearsed, over years, one dinner party at a time, until the timing lived in her body rather than in any written rule. The thank you note was really a feedback loop, and a fast one. A hostess who received warm, specific notes the following week learned exactly which parts of her evening had landed: the centerpiece, the dessert, a particular story someone told. She adjusted her next party accordingly. That kind of specific, prompt feedback is something most modern hosts never get at all, because a text saying, "Great party," rarely tells you anything. The hostess gift rule also protected something fragile: the evening's momentum. A guest who showed up needing a vase or expecting her wine opened immediately, however small the request, pulled the hostess's attention away from the room at the exact moment she needed to be present in it. The rule was never about the gift. It was about never becoming one more task on an already full night. The make-ahead casserole deserves a defense it rarely gets today. It was not a lesser meal, it was engineering. A dish built the day before, finished in the oven while guests sipped their cocktails, let one woman produce a 4-course evening with 0 domestic help. Calling that dated misses the point entirely. It was one of the most efficient hosting systems this country has ever quietly invented. The outside-in rule for silverware solved a problem nobody wants to admit exists: the fear of doing it wrong in front of other people. By making the table itself the instruction manual, course by course, a guest who had never seen a formal setting in her life could still follow along without asking a single embarrassing question. The rule protected dignity as much as it protected etiquette. The Bridge Club's real genius was its regularity. A once-a-year party takes enormous energy and mostly evaporates from memory within a season. A standing weekly table, by contrast, builds a friendship the way water shapes stone, slowly, through repetition, until those women knew each other's lives in granular detail simply because they kept showing up on the same afternoon, year after year. The magazine test kitchens deserve more credit than history has given them. These were real professional kitchens, who test by home economists for reliability under ordinary home conditions before printing them for millions of readers. A recipe that failed in an average kitchen never made it to the page. That quiet quality control is part of why so many mid-century recipe cards, handed down today, still simply work. The green stamps ritual taught something else too: patience as a household value. Saving stamp by stamp toward a punch bowl or a set of glasses meant that company items arrived slowly, deliberately, and were treasured precisely because of the wait. Nothing about entertaining was instant in that decade, and the slowness itself became part of what made the finished table feel special when guests finally arrived. The fading calling card ritual is worth pausing on, because it shows how gradually these habits actually died. Nobody woke up one morning and declared the calling card finished. It simply got used less, year by year, quietly replaced by the telephone call, until an entire generation later could barely explain what a calling card had even been for. Most of these rituals ended exactly that way, in silence, not in a single dramatic moment. The Tupperware party model succeeded because it borrowed every one of these hosting instincts and pointed them at commerce: the timed gathering, the living room as stage, the hostess as the trusted center of the room. Brownie Wise did not invent the idea that women's living rooms were valuable social ground. She simply noticed it was already true and built a company around it. The backyard barbecue and the formal dinner shared one thing in common that we tend to overlook. Both required the same underlying skill: reading a room and keeping it comfortable. The tools were different: charcoal smoke instead of candlelight, paper plates instead of china. But the craft underneath, making strangers feel easy together, was identical whether the gathering cost $2 or $20. The national magazine curriculum meant something else worth noticing. A housewife who had never met her neighbor in Georgia was still, in a real sense, cooking from the same playbook that same week. That shared culture created a kind of quiet solidarity across the whole country, a common language of hosting that let any two women from opposite coasts sit down and immediately understand what the other one had done to prepare. The careful guest list, arranged like a script, protected the quiet guests as much as it entertained the loud ones. A shy neighbor placed beside a warm, easy talker had a far better evening than the same shy neighbor left to fend for herself at the end of a long table. That kind of small, deliberate kindness rarely gets remembered as etiquette, but it absolutely was. The economics of home entertaining shaped more than budgets; it shaped confidence. Knowing a full dinner party cost a fraction of a restaurant meal meant a young couple could host often, could practice the craft, could fail quietly at a first attempt, and simply try again the following month. Frequency built skill. Nobody becomes a great hostess after one single dinner party, and this decade gave women the room to keep trying. Television's slow creep into the living room is worth one more look, because it marks the true beginning of the end for this entire way of gathering. At first, it was a shared novelty, everyone facing the same direction, still talking through the commercials. It would take a full generation before that same shared glow pulled families apart into separate rooms entirely, but the first crack opened right there in a 1950s parlor. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and that phrase applies here more than anywhere. Nobody archived the exact wording of a 1950s seating rule or the precise angle of a folded napkin. These habits survived only in the muscle memory of the women who practiced them, and when that generation stopped hosting, most of it simply evaporated, unrecorded, ordinary, and gone. By the 1960s, the cracks widened. The fondue party arrived as a lower-effort alternative to the full formal dinner, and the casual buffet started replacing the plated, course-by-course meal in many households. These were not failures of the old system. They were the first honest admissions that the full formal ritual took more time than a growing number of women, now working outside the home in greater numbers, actually had left to give it. The 70s pushed further still. Second-wave feminism and rising numbers of women in paid work fundamentally changed the math behind the multi-day dinner party. A woman with a full-time job outside the house simply did not have the daylight hours her mother had spent, basting a roast and polishing silver. Convenience foods, once a supplement, became the backbone of the meal, and the potluck rose to fill the gap the formal dinner left behind. By the 80s, the formal dinner party with courses and place cards had become something reserved for holidays and special occasions rather than an ordinary Tuesday habit. The backyard cookout and the casual gathering took over as the default. Something had been traded away in that shift. Not the food, but the structure, the small formal rituals that used to turn an average evening into something guests still remembered years later. The 90s and 2000s brought takeout containers and delivery menus stacked in kitchen drawers, and the home entertaining evening began drifting toward the television rather than the table. It disappeared from dinner parties, but it still works. That phrase keeps returning here, because every single habit we have named through this video is still just as functional today as it was in 1954, waiting to be picked back up. Food delivery apps arriving in the 2010s finished what television and convenience food had started decades earlier. A hot meal could now appear at the door in 30 minutes with no shopping, no cooking, and no table setting required at all. It solved hunger completely, and it solved almost nothing about connection, which is exactly the gap that this channel keeps circling back to, week after week. And yet here we are, decades later, and interest in exactly these old habits keeps quietly climbing. Estate sales sell out of vintage china sets faster than they used to. Younger buyers are hunting down the very glassware their grandmothers saved green stamps to earn. Something in us recognizes what got lost, even if we could not have named it before watching this list. In 2023, the United States Surgeon General issued a formal advisory naming loneliness a serious public health concern, and that conversation has only grown louder since. People are once again asking how we rebuild the kind of ordinary, regular, in-person gathering that used to be built into a normal week rather than saved for a special occasion. The 1950s dinner party was never perfect, but it was, at its core, a structured answer to exactly that question. So let's walk back through these 20 habits one more time, not as museum pieces, but as tools any of us could actually pick back up this month. Not the whole elaborate machine at once. Nobody needs 3 forks and a seating chart for a Tuesday. Just one habit, chosen on purpose, brought back into an ordinary evening. Start with the cocktail hour, even a simple 20-minute version. Set drinks and a small dish of something out. Let people stand and talk before anyone sits down to eat. That single pause, unhurried and unplanned around a screen, changes the entire tone of an evening more than any recipe you could serve. Bring back the seating chart next, even scribbled on a scrap of paper the morning of the party. Break up the couples who already sit together every single day. Put the quiet guest next to the warm talker. It takes 90 seconds to plan, and it changes who your guests actually end up talking to for the entire evening. Write the thank you note. It sounds small, almost quaint, but a handwritten line mailed the next day still lands differently than a text ever will. Your grandmother knew how to make a room feel like home, and part of how she did it was making sure the people who came felt remembered again after they had already left. Pull out the good dishes, whatever your version of good dishes actually is. The set you inherited, the set you bought and never use, the mismatched pieces that still mean something. Using them for an ordinary Tuesday, not just a holiday, honors exactly the instinct that built this whole ritual in the first place, that an evening with people you care about deserves your best table. Make one dish the day before. Just one. Free yourself the way a 1950s hostess freed herself, so that when guests actually arrive, you are standing in the doorway instead of trapped at the stove. The whole system was built around protecting her presence in the room, and that single piece of it is still the most useful habit on this entire list. None of this requires a return to formality for formality's sake. Nobody is asking you to iron linen napkins or memorize which fork belongs to which course. What these habits share, underneath all the specific detail, is a single idea that hosting is not the food on the table, it is the attention paid to the people sitting around it. Think about the woman in that first Cape Cod house again, checking the clock, smoothing her apron. She was not performing wealth or status in that moment. She was building, one small rule at a time, a room where people would feel comfortable enough to stay past dessert, to linger over coffee, to actually talk to each other instead of glancing at a screen. That is the whole secret, and it was never complicated. It is worth saying plainly, this was not an easy decade for every household, and the etiquette guides describe an aspirational ideal rather than a universal reality. Income, region, and background shaped how closely any one family could actually follow these rules. But the underlying instinct that a home should be prepared on purpose for the people who enter it crossed nearly every kitchen in the country in some form. And it is worth resisting the urge to call the whole decade some lost golden age either. These women worked hard, often alone, without the domestic help their own mothers had relied on, folding childcare and cooking and cleaning and hosting into the very same afternoon. What deserves admiration is not the era itself, but the skill and intention these women brought to an impossible workload and made look effortless. The parlor remembers, even when we forget, and that is really the whole reason this channel exists. Every one of these 20 habits was invented by an ordinary woman solving an ordinary problem. How do I make 3 strangers feel like old friends by the time dessert arrives? Nobody wrote a manual with her name on it. She simply figured it out and then taught it to the next woman down the street. Somewhere in an attic right now, in a box nobody has opened in decades, there is probably a stack of place cards in a stranger's handwriting, or a punch bowl still wrapped in its original tissue paper, waiting for someone to recognize what it actually represents. Not clutter. A whole discipline of hospitality, quietly folded away and never quite finished. If even one of these 20 habits found its way back into your next gathering, the cocktail hour, the handwritten note, the seating chart scratched out on a napkin, you would already be doing more than most hosts attempt today. That is not nostalgia for its own sake. That is simply good practice, rediscovered. Picture that same house again one more time, years later. The couple who bought it for under $8,000 are grandparents now, their dining room table sold at an estate sale, or handed down to a daughter who has no idea what half these rules even were. And yet somewhere, a granddaughter is setting a table tonight, 3 forks, outside in, without fully knowing why she learned it that way. That is the real thread running through all 20 of these habits. They outlived their original reasons. The dishwasher exists now. The domestic help problem is different. The magazines with their test kitchens have mostly folded. And still, when a table is set with real intention, people notice, and they stay longer, and they talk more, exactly the way they did in 1954. There is a particular kind of quiet pride in doing something well that nobody is forcing you to do. No one required that hostess to fold her napkins a certain way, or write place cards in her best hand, or time a roast to the minute. She did it because a room built with that much care felt like something worth offering the people she loved. That instinct has not gone anywhere. It is simply waiting to be used again. If you have your grandmother's punch bowl, her good silver, her handwritten recipe cards stained at the corners, you already own the tools. What most of us are missing is not the objects. It is the 20 small habits that told a hostess exactly what to do with them, and in what order, and why it mattered. So here is the invitation this whole video has really been building toward. Pick one habit, just one. Try it this month on an ordinary Tuesday for no special occasion at all. See what changes in the room when you do. That is exactly how every single one of these rituals started in the first place. One woman, one evening, one small decision to try. None of this is really about the 1950s at all, not underneath it. It is about a kind of attention we let slip away without ever quite deciding to. The decade is simply where the clearest record of that attention happens to survive. in magazine pages, in handwritten cards, in china nobody threw away. That is why this channel keeps going back into rooms like the one we opened with tonight, a Cape Cod dining room, a woman checking a clock, a table set for people who have not yet arrived. Not because the past was perfect, because somewhere in all that careful, unwritten discipline is a better instinct than the one most of us default to now, and it is worth remembering on purpose. The ritual was never written down, but every good hostess knew it by heart, and for one more generation at least, it does not have to stay forgotten. 20 habits, quiet and unglamorous on their own, added up to something that made an ordinary Tuesday feel like an occasion. That is not a small thing. That may be one of the most useful things anyone in that decade ever figured out. So the next time you are tempted to order in and eat on the couch, think about that woman smoothing her apron, checking the clock twice, ready for a Tuesday that would become a story her guests told for years. You do not need her whole world back. You only need one of her habits, tried once, on purpose. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and every video on this channel is an attempt to bring one more piece of it back into the light, one table setting, one forgotten habit, one Tuesday at a time. If this brought back a memory of your own grandmother's table, tell me about it in the comments. I read everyone. And if you want the next lost ritual of the American parlor waiting for you, subscribe, and I will see you at the next table. Your grandmother knew how to make a room feel like home. Let's keep learning how she did it, together.